Introduction and the strategic appeal of Arabia. The mighty empire meets its match. The Roman Empire, a colossal force that once dominated the known world, thrived on its ability to conquer and assimilate. From the windswept shores of Britain to the fertile lands of Egypt, no challenge seemed insurmountable. Rome's legions were unstoppable, their ambitions limitless, and their strategies unmatched. Yet, as they gazed southward toward the Arabian Peninsula, even their boundless confidence faltered. Arabia, a land of legend, mystery, and untold riches. For the Romans, it was more than just a stretch of desert. It was the key to unlocking the treasures of the Far East. Silks, spices, frankincense, and myrrh were the lifeblood of luxury, coveted by Rome's elite and seen as essential to the empire's cultural and economic supremacy. To conquer Arabia was to secure a direct route to this opulence. But Arabia was no ordinary prize. It was a land of blazing deserts and treacherous mountains, guarded by resilient tribes who valued freedom above all. As the Romans soon discovered, their conquest machine, honed through centuries of success, was ill-suited for this enigmatic land. A map with a blank spot. At its height, the Roman Empire sprawled across an astounding 5 million square kilometers. Rome's legions had conquered the Mediterranean, subdued North Africa, and claimed the wealth of Egypt. Yet one glaring blank spot remained on the Roman map: Arabia. Why couldn't Rome fill this void? This question reveals a tale not just of military might and failure, but also of geography, culture, and resilience. Arabia was more than an unclaimed frontier. It was a challenge to Rome's identity as a world-conquering power. As Emperor Augustus ascended to power in 27 BCE, Rome's appetite for expansion was insatiable. Augustus's vision was clear: transform the empire into an unstoppable force of wealth and influence. And Arabia, with its strategic location and wealth, was a prize too tantalizing to ignore. Arabia, the treasure Rome couldn't reach. The allure of Arabia lay in its position as a gateway to the east. Trade routes crisscrossed the peninsula, connecting the Mediterranean to India and China. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested in the verdant regions of southern Arabia, were so valuable they were often referred to as liquid gold. Roman aristocrats burned these resins in religious ceremonies, their scents filling temples and homes, symbolizing wealth and divine favor. Rome's desire to control this trade was as much about prestige as profit. Augustus and his successors knew that dominating the Arabian Peninsula would cement Rome's position as the nexus of global commerce. Southern Arabia, or Arabia Felix, was especially coveted. The Romans called it Happy Arabia because of its lush valleys, prosperous cities, and bustling ports. But the journey to this promised land was fraught with peril. The Arabian Peninsula's vast deserts were unforgiving, its climate merciless, and its inhabitants fiercely independent. It was a land that demanded respect and punished arrogance, a lesson Rome would learn the hard way. A land of natural fortresses, Arabia's geography was a conqueror's nightmare. Unlike the rolling plains of Gaul or the navigable rivers of Germania, Arabia offered no easy pathways for invasion. The northern region, known as Arabia Petrea, was a rugged terrain dominated by sandstone cliffs and deep canyons. To the south lay the empty quarter, a vast desert stretching as far as the eye could see, its dunes shifting like waves in a sea of sand. Rome's supply lines, crucial for maintaining an army on the march, would be stretched to their breaking point in such conditions. Water was scarce, and the searing heat sapped the strength of even the hardiest legionnaire. The Romans, masters of engineering, found themselves outmatched by the land itself. The Arabian tribes had no such difficulties. They had lived in harmony with their environment for centuries, mastering the art of desert survival. They knew where to find water, how to navigate the dunes, and how to endure the relentless sun. For the Romans, these natural defenses were as formidable as any army, a fractured but resilient society. Politically, Arabia was a patchwork of tribes and small kingdoms, each fiercely independent. This decentralized structure could have been a weakness, but it became a strength when faced with foreign invaders. The Romans, accustomed to dealing with centralized powers like the Egyptians or Carthaginians, struggled to adapt. The Nabateans, who controlled the incense route in northwestern Arabia, were a prime example of this resilience. Their capital, Petra, was a marvel of engineering, its buildings carved directly into rose-red cliffs. The Nabateans used their wealth and knowledge of the land to resist Roman domination. When the Roman general Aelius Gallus marched into Arabia in 25 BCE, the Nabateans provided guides for his expedition. But these guides, loyal to their people, deliberately led the Roman army into the most inhospitable parts of the desert. By the time Gallus reached his objective, the city of Marib, his army was decimated by heat, thirst, and disease, the rise and fall of Roman ambitions. Despite this disastrous campaign, Rome did not give up entirely on Arabia. Over the next century, emperors like Trajan and Septimius Severus attempted to establish control over parts of the peninsula. They succeeded in annexing Arabia Petrea, transforming it into a Roman province. But southern Arabia, the true prize, remained elusive. The Romans realized that the cost of conquering Arabia Felix far outweighed the benefits. The logistical challenges, combined with the fierce resistance of the Arab tribes, made further campaigns untenable. By the 3rd century CE, Rome had shifted its focus to defending its existing borders. The empire was under constant pressure from Germanic tribes in the west and Persian armies in the east. Conquering Arabia became a dream deferred, then abandoned. A lesson in humility. Rome's failure to conquer Arabia was not merely a military defeat. It was a humbling reminder of the limits of power. The Arabian Peninsula, with its unforgiving terrain and indomitable people, proved that even the mightiest empire had its boundaries. This story is not just about Rome's shortcomings, but also about the resilience of the Arabs. Their ability to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth and to resist one of history's most formidable empires is a testament to their ingenuity and determination. As we continue this exploration, we'll delve deeper into the economic stakes, the strategic missteps, and the legacy of this failed conquest. Arabia's story is not just one of resistance but also of connection. A land that remained a vital crossroads of civilizations, even as it defied Rome's grasp. Would Rome have succeeded if it had approached Arabia differently? Or was the desert destined to remain unconquerable? Stay with us as we unravel these mysteries in the next chapter of this captivating saga. The Roman campaign in Arabia, ambition meets reality. A new emperor's vision, Augustus looks south. In 25 BCE, Augustus stood at the pinnacle of power. Having transitioned Rome from a turbulent republic into a stable empire, he was eager to leave an indelible mark on history. His ambitions stretched far beyond Rome's established borders, and Arabia loomed large in his sights. The Arabian Peninsula represented both a strategic and symbolic conquest. Controlling Arabia Felix would allow Rome to dominate the lucrative incense trade, secure a direct link to India's spices, and overshadow rival powers like Parthia. Augustus believed that by achieving this, he could immortalize his reign as the greatest period of Roman expansion. But Augustus was no reckless adventurer. He appointed Aelius Gallus, a trusted general and prefect of Egypt, to lead the charge into Arabia. Gallus was equipped with the finest troops, the best engineers, and detailed intelligence about the land, or so Augustus believed. The Aelius Gallus campaign, missteps in the desert. The campaign began with promise. In 25 BCE, Gallus marched out of Egypt with an army of nearly 10,000 men, including Roman legions, auxiliary troops, and Arab allies recruited from the Nabateans. His objective was clear: reach Marib, the capital of the Sabaean kingdom in southern Arabia, and establish Roman dominance. But from the very beginning, things went awry. Gallus relied on Nabatean guides to navigate the treacherous terrain. However, these guides, loyal to their own people, deliberately misled the Roman army. They directed Gallus's forces into arid wastelands, far from water sources and fertile oases. The army's progress slowed to a crawl as men and animals succumbed to thirst and exhaustion. The Arabian desert was unlike anything the Romans had encountered. Days were scorching, nights bitterly cold, and sandstorms could swallow entire contingents. Supplies dwindled alarmingly as logistical challenges mounted. Roman soldiers, trained for battle in temperate Europe or the fertile lands of the Mediterranean, found themselves battling nature instead of enemy forces. As the weeks dragged on, disease spread through the ranks. Malaria, dysentery, and dehydration decimated the army, weakening its fighting capacity. Morale plummeted as soldiers began to question the wisdom of this seemingly endless march. The Sabaean kingdom, an elusive target. Despite these hardships, Gallus pressed on. His target, the city of Marib, was no ordinary settlement. The Sabaeans were an advanced civilization, renowned for their wealth and ingenuity. They had constructed the Marib Dam, a massive engineering marvel that turned the desert into fertile farmland. The Sabaeans were not blind to Rome's ambitions. They knew the value of their land and resources and were prepared to defend them fiercely. While the Sabaeans lacked the military power of Rome, their knowledge of the terrain and their alliances with neighboring tribes gave them an edge. By the time Gallus's army reached the outskirts of Marib, it was in no condition to fight. Exhausted, starving, and demoralized, the Romans faced a well-prepared enemy entrenched in its stronghold. A bitter retreat. Realizing the futility of further efforts, Gallus ordered a retreat. The journey back was even more disastrous than the march south. Depleted supplies and constant harassment by Arabian tribes turned the retreat into a desperate struggle for survival. By the time Gallus returned to Egypt, he had lost a significant portion of his army. The campaign was a humiliating failure, and Augustus was furious. Official accounts of the campaign were carefully crafted to downplay the defeat, but the truth could not be hidden. Rome had met its match in Arabia. Why did Rome fail? The failure of the Aelius Gallus campaign was not merely a result of bad luck. It was a convergence of several key factors. Arabia's harsh environment was more formidable than any army Rome had faced. The combination of extreme heat, scarce water, and vast distances proved insurmountable for an invading force reliant on long supply lines. Rome's reliance on the Nabateans as guides was a critical mistake. The Nabateans had their own interests and were not invested in Rome's success. Their deliberate misdirection doomed the campaign from the outset. The Romans, accustomed to success, underestimated the resilience and resourcefulness of the Arabian tribes. This hubris blinded them to the complexities of waging war in such an alien environment. Rome's famed engineering and logistical prowess were inadequate for the demands of the Arabian campaign. The inability to secure reliable water sources and maintain supply lines turned the march into a death march. The aftermath, Rome's shifting focus. The failure of the Gallus campaign marked the end of Rome's serious attempts to conquer southern Arabia. While the Romans continued to exert influence over northern Arabia, they never again ventured into the heart of the peninsula. Instead, Rome shifted its focus to controlling trade indirectly. The Nabateans, who had once sabotaged Gallus's campaign, became key allies and intermediaries in the incense trade. By leveraging diplomacy and economic influence, Rome achieved many of its goals without risking further military debacles. Legacy of the campaign. The Roman attempt to conquer Arabia Felix left an indelible mark on history. The failure of Rome highlighted the strength and unity of the Arabian tribes when faced with external threats. It reinforced the image of Arabia as a land of fierce independence and unyielding defiance. Rome's defeat in Arabia served as a humbling reminder of the limits of imperial ambition. It demonstrated that even the most powerful empires could be thwarted by the natural world and the determination of local peoples. The Gallus campaign forced Rome to reconsider its approach to expansion. Rather than pursuing direct conquest, Rome began to rely more on economic influence and cultural assimilation to achieve its goals. The desert's silent victory. As the centuries passed, the Arabian Peninsula remained largely outside the reach of foreign empires. The desert, with its shifting sands and hidden oases, became a symbol of unyielding resistance. Today, the story of Rome's failed conquest of Arabia stands as a testament to the power of nature and the resilience of human spirit. It reminds us that even the greatest ambitions can falter in the face of a determined adversary and an unforgiving land. Stay tuned as we explore how this epic chapter influenced the trade networks, cultural exchanges, and geopolitical dynamics of the ancient world. The story of Rome and Arabia is far from over. It's a tale of ambition, resilience, and the enduring mysteries of the desert. The enduring legacy, Rome's influence on Arabia and beyond. The aftermath of defeat, Rome's changed approach. The failure of Aelius Gallus's campaign against Arabia had shaken the foundations of Roman imperial ambition. The grandeur of Augustus's vision for expansion into the Arabian Peninsula had been dramatically shattered, but the empire's desire for dominance did not falter. Rome's approach to foreign conquest evolved after the debacle in Arabia, shaping the way it interacted with regions beyond its borders. The failure did not extinguish the Roman desire to control Arabia. Rather, it recalibrated the empire's methods of influence. Yet, the lessons of Gallus's defeat were hard-learned. The campaigns of expansion, once thought to be assured by Roman might and strategy, now had to contend with deeper questions. Was it worth pursuing a land that proved so resistant to Rome's overwhelming power? Could the riches of Arabia be acquired without direct military subjugation? These questions would haunt Roman policymakers for years, pushing them to innovate in the areas of diplomacy and economic strategy. Rome's shift from conquest to diplomacy and trade. In the wake of Gallus's defeat, Rome shifted its priorities from direct conquest to economic dominance. Rather than pouring resources into further military expeditions into the heart of Arabia, Rome began to focus on controlling trade routes and establishing alliances. The Arabian Peninsula had long been a crucial node in global trade, acting as a bridge between the Mediterranean world, India, and Africa. The incense trade, especially the lucrative frankincense and myrrh, was one of the most important commodities of the ancient world. This trade was the lifeblood of kingdoms such as the Nabatean and Sabaean civilizations. These were the treasures Rome sought to control, not by force, but through persuasion, alliances, and economic influence. By the time of Augustus's successor, Tiberius, Rome had adopted a strategy of indirect control. Through trade agreements, diplomatic alliances, and the leveraging of local powers like the Nabateans, the Romans ensured that they could profit from Arabia's riches without the risk of direct military engagement. This shift also allowed Rome to maintain peace with its eastern neighbors, particularly the Parthians, who had remained a powerful force in the region since the time of Crassus's ill-fated campaign. The Nabateans, Rome's strategic ally. At the center of this new Roman strategy was the Kingdom of Nabatea. Located in the modern-day regions of Jordan, Syria, and Saudi Arabia, the Nabateans controlled the critical trade routes that linked the Mediterranean world with the Arabian Peninsula. The Nabatean capital, Petra, was a city like no other, carved into the rose-red cliffs of the Jordanian desert. Petra stood as a symbol of the advanced engineering and commercial prowess of the Nabateans. It was a city of wealth, where merchants from the Roman world, India, and Africa mingled, exchanging goods and stories. Rome's relationship with the Nabateans was built on mutual benefit. The Nabateans needed the protection and political support of Rome to secure their trading routes against external threats. In return, the Romans gained unfettered access to the valuable incense trade, among other goods. This was a classic example of Roman diplomacy at its finest, an empire that learned to use its influence without the need for bloodshed. Despite their alliance, the Nabateans retained a degree of autonomy, choosing to maintain their sovereignty while operating within the Roman sphere of influence. This relationship allowed both powers to benefit. Rome could enjoy the wealth of Arabia without the cost of direct conquest, and the Nabateans preserved their culture and independence while gaining protection from Rome's might. The Sabaeans and the incense trade, a new Roman strategy. While the Nabateans were key to Rome's success in the Arabian trade networks, the Sabaeans, located further south in modern-day Yemen, held the monopoly over the most coveted of all Arabian exports, frankincense and myrrh. These substances were revered not only for their economic value but for their religious and cultural significance, used in everything from perfumes to sacred rituals. The Romans, ever aware of the significance of this trade, turned to diplomacy once again. Unlike their direct attempts to conquer the Sabaean kingdom under Gallus, The Romans now sought to secure the incense trade through strategic alliances. Over the years, the Romans established trade agreements that ensured the steady flow of incense and other luxury goods to the empire. This was achieved not by force, but through complex negotiations with local rulers and trade intermediaries. The Sabaean kingdom, once an independent and proud civilization, eventually succumbed to political and economic pressure from both Rome and its neighboring empires. By the 1st century CE, the Sabaeans were absorbed into the broader Roman sphere of influence, though they retained a measure of independence until the kingdom's collapse. This gradual shift mirrored Rome's broader approach to the Arabian Peninsula. The Romans had learned that indirect control, through alliances, trade, and diplomacy, was far more effective than direct military intervention. The Parthian rivalry, a Roman watchful eye on the east. While Rome's ambitions in Arabia were often focused on economic exploitation, the eastern frontier remained a critical point of tension. The Parthian Empire, a powerful and sophisticated civilization to Rome's east, was a constant rival. Rome had already faced setbacks in Parthia, most notably during the disastrous defeat at Carrhae in 53 BCE, and the Parthians were eager to maintain their control over territories that lay just beyond Roman reach. The Arabian Peninsula, with its strategic importance as a land bridge between the Mediterranean world and India, was a battleground for influence between the two empires. While the Romans sought to control the Arabian trade routes through diplomacy and alliances, the Parthians also courted local Arabian tribes to secure their own economic footholds in the region. This rivalry played out in the form of proxy wars and political maneuvering. Roman influence in the Arabian Peninsula was constantly challenged by Parthian efforts to win the loyalty of the Arabian tribes. But Rome's superior military and diplomatic prowess often tipped the scales in its favor, ensuring that its economic interests in Arabia were largely secured. The end of the Roman dream in Arabia. Despite the Roman successes in establishing trade and diplomatic relations in Arabia, the dream of direct imperial control over the region was never fully realized. The desert, with its harsh conditions, vast distances, and unpredictable local politics, proved to be a land too elusive for Rome's imperial ambitions. Over time, the Roman Empire turned its attention elsewhere. The rise of the Sasanian Empire in Persia and the ongoing threat of barbarian invasions from the north kept Roman forces stretched thin. While Arabia remained an important part of the Roman economic system, the dream of conquering it was ultimately abandoned. However, the indirect control Rome exercised over the Arabian trade routes had lasting effects. Roman luxury goods, coins, and artifacts have been found as far south as modern-day Yemen, evidence of the long-lasting influence of Roman commerce. The Roman fascination with Arabia, despite its failure to conquer the region, marked a turning point in how empires interacted with their neighbors. Not through brute force, but through a careful blend of diplomacy, economic leverage, and strategic alliances. A legacy across time. As the centuries passed, the legacy of Rome's interactions with Arabia endured in ways that even Augustus and his successors could not have foreseen. The trade routes that Rome sought to control continued to flourish, even after the fall of the Roman Empire. The networks of commerce, culture, and religion that emerged from Roman influence would lay the foundations for future empires, including the Islamic caliphates that would later dominate the Arabian Peninsula. The Romans may not have conquered Arabia, but their influence left an indelible mark on the region's history. Through trade, diplomacy, and their ability to adapt to the challenges of the desert, Rome forged a legacy that lasted long after their empire crumbled. The story of Rome's ambitions in Arabia serves as a reminder of the power of adaptability, of learning from failure and finding new paths to success. The desert may have resisted Rome, but in the end, the empire left behind a legacy that would shape the world for centuries to come. The Roman dream and the shifting sands. The long shadow of empire. The Roman Empire and the changing world order. Rome's encounters with Arabia, particularly its ambitious yet ultimately unsuccessful attempts to conquer the Arabian Peninsula, were deeply symbolic of the broader arc of Roman imperialism. In the heart of the ancient world, Rome stood as a beacon of power and civilization, expanding its borders across continents, from the windswept hills of Britain to the deserts of Egypt and beyond. Yet, Despite its immense military might and sophisticated strategies, there were limits to what Rome could achieve. Arabia, with its rugged terrain and fiercely independent tribes, proved to be one of those limits. But why did Rome, an empire that had toppled the mighty Carthaginians, defied the Parthian forces, and conquered vast swaths of Europe and North Africa, ultimately fail to conquer Arabia? What was it about this harsh and inhospitable land that thwarted the ambitions of an empire that had once seemed unstoppable? To understand this, we must look deeper into the shifting nature of Rome's global strategy, as well as the forces that were slowly pulling the empire in different directions. The world of the late 1st century BCE and early CE was one in which Roman power was starting to face real and existential threats. From the internal strife of civil wars to the looming presence of the Parthian Empire in the east, Rome was finding itself stretched thin across the vast territories it controlled. At the same time, Rome's military strategy, which had once been founded on overwhelming force and direct conquest, was starting to evolve. The era of aggressive expansion, where new provinces were seized and the empire's borders expanded with seemingly endless energy, was beginning to give way to a more cautious, calculated approach. It was a time when Roman military might was being matched by strategic diplomacy, and the focus shifted from territorial conquest to consolidating and protecting existing borders. The harsh realities of the Arabian Peninsula, coupled with the growing instability in the empire's eastern provinces, played a significant role in this transformation. The story of Rome's failed conquest of Arabia, then, is more than just a tale of military defeat. It is a reflection of the empire's changing priorities in the face of a rapidly evolving global landscape. Rome's changing strategy, the diplomatic age. By the end of Augustus's reign, the Roman Empire had come to realize the limitations of its traditional method of expansion. The enormous costs of continuous warfare, coupled with the logistical nightmares of maintaining such vast territories, began to weigh heavily on the empire's resources. For the Romans, war was no longer an endless, unchallenged expansion, but rather a delicate balance between military conquest and diplomatic negotiations. It is here that the role of diplomacy, trade, and alliances began to take center stage. Rome's failure to subjugate Arabia in the traditional sense did not signal the end of Roman interest in the region. Instead, the empire found more subtle ways to influence the Arabian Peninsula, primarily through the power of trade and the strategic manipulation of local rulers. Rome's diplomacy with Arabia began to reflect the changing character of imperial rule. Rather than annexing Arabia through force, Rome shifted its focus to securing its interests through economic leverage and forging political ties with Arabian rulers like the Nabatean king Aretas IV. By aligning with local powers, Rome could access the wealth of Arabia, including frankincense, myrrh, and other precious goods, without the need for direct control. This period marks the height of Rome's new diplomatic prowess. The Romans had mastered the art of securing their interests through the tools of statecraft, and the Arabian Peninsula became an important stage for showcasing this newfound skill. The idea of empire was transforming, from one rooted in military occupation to one based on indirect control through diplomacy, trade, and economic influence. The role of the trade routes, connecting east and west. The Romans, like many empires throughout history, understood that control over trade routes was often more valuable than the territories themselves. The Arabian Peninsula, situated at the crossroads of east and west, was a critical nexus for the ancient trade networks that spanned from India to Africa, and from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. The Roman Empire was always a commercial empire as much as a military one. Its vast infrastructure, its roads, ports, and markets, was designed to facilitate trade across its territories. The control of these routes allowed Rome to access goods and resources that were crucial to its economy. Arabia, with its rich deposits of frankincense and myrrh, was central to this network, and Rome's interest in the region was driven less by military conquest and more by economic necessity. However, the control of these trade routes was never straightforward. Other powers, such as the Parthians to the east, had their own designs on the region, competing for access to these lucrative trade routes. And the Arabian tribes themselves, fiercely independent and warlike, were not easy to subdue. The Roman strategy, therefore, was not one of direct occupation but rather indirect influence, controlling the flow of goods and manipulating local rulers to secure Rome's place in the trade network. Rome's relationship with the Arabian trading powers was thus one of mutual benefit. While the Romans were able to access valuable goods, the Arabian kingdoms were able to benefit from the political and military protection offered by Roman alliances. This relationship, built on trade and diplomacy rather than military conquest, would last long after the failure of the Roman military campaigns in Arabia. The decline of the Roman Empire, Arabia's independence. As the Roman Empire reached its peak, the question of Arabia's future role in the world began to change. By the 3rd century CE, Rome was facing multiple threats on various fronts. The empire's borders, already stretched thin, were constantly under siege, whether by Germanic tribes to the north, Parthians to the east, or internal dissent within the empire itself. These pressures began to erode the coherence of Roman control, and even as the empire retained its diplomatic and economic dominance, its ability to enforce direct military control over far-flung territories like Arabia became increasingly limited. During this period, Arabia began to chart its own course. The rise of the Sasanian Empire in Persia further complicated Roman interests in the region, and the Arab tribes, long under the influence of both Rome and Persia, began to form their own identities. These groups, especially the nomadic Bedouins, would eventually become the dominant political and military force in the region. By the time of the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the power dynamics in the Arabian Peninsula had shifted irrevocably. In the centuries following Rome's abandonment of its ambitions in Arabia, the region would see the rise of new empires and dynasties, first the Sassanids and later the Islamic caliphates, who would push Rome's influence from the region entirely. But even as Roman political control waned, the legacy of Roman trade, infrastructure, and diplomacy remained. The Roman Empire, though no longer physically present in Arabia, had established patterns of exchange and interaction that would continue to shape the region for centuries. The enduring influence of Rome in the Arabian Peninsula. Despite the failure of its military campaigns, Rome's enduring influence on Arabia cannot be overstated. Rome's interactions with the Arabian Peninsula, whether through trade, diplomacy, or cultural exchange, shaped the region in profound ways. The Romans left behind a legacy of infrastructure, trade routes, and cultural exchange that would become the foundation for later empires and civilizations. Even in the centuries following the fall of the Roman Empire, the legacies of Roman architecture, coinage, and trade continued to reverberate throughout the Arabian world. Roman coins have been found in the deserts of Arabia, evidence of the long-standing economic ties between Rome and the Arabian kingdoms. Roman-style buildings and roads were also constructed in key Arabian cities like Petra, where Roman influence remained even after the empire's political control had dissipated. In many ways, the Roman story in Arabia is one of persistence. The Roman dream of conquering Arabia was a dream never fully realized through military might, but it was realized in other ways, through economic dominance, cultural exchange, and the lasting relationships forged between Rome and the peoples of Arabia. A lasting legacy. The Roman Empire, despite its eventual fall, had changed the course of history in ways that reverberated far beyond the Mediterranean world. The empire's interactions with the Arabian Peninsula were but one chapter in a larger narrative of empire, trade, and cultural exchange. Even in defeat, Rome left behind a profound legacy of diplomacy, trade, and infrastructure that shaped the future of the Arabian world and would influence the rise of new empires in the centuries to come. As we conclude our exploration of Rome's interactions with Arabia, we are reminded of the complexity of empire, the limits of conquest, and the enduring power of diplomacy and cultural exchange. Rome may have failed to conquer Arabia by force, but in the grand arc of history, its influence on the Arabian Peninsula and on the wider world remains undeniable. This story, a blend of ambition, failure, adaptation, and legacy, is a testament to the enduring power of Rome. It serves as a reminder that even in the most ambitious of failures, an empire's influence can echo across centuries, shaping the course of history in ways never fully anticipated. Stay with us as we continue to unravel the stories of great empires, their triumphs, their failures, and their legacies that continue to shape our world today.